So the chipset is an integral part of the motherboard and mainly comprises the north bridge and the south bridge chip. It may also include video functionality that comes with the motherboard. A lot of motherboards have built-in video. That didn't used to be the case. Earlier motherboards didn't have built-in video, but today's usually do. But sometimes we want to add more powerful video, so we can add that with a video card. Now here's another look at today's PC architecture, just a nice overview of it. Here we have the CPU, and again the CPU connects directly to the north bridge chip through the local bus, or front side bus as it's often referred to. The north bridge chip also connects to the memory through the memory bus. So one of the major jobs of the north bridge is to act as a go-between between the CPU and the memory. Then the north bridge chip connects through the I/O bus to the south bridge chip, and the south bridge job is to talk to slower devices such as the hard drive, such as the some of the input and output ports like USB or the Ethernet port, which is relatively slower compared to the memory, for example. And another thing that it would communicate with would be if you had older style PCI slots. The north bridge chip also communicates with higher speed expansion slots, like it would communicate with if you had a special slot for a video card, or if you had PCI slots, PCI Express. All those things would connect directly to the north bridge. So that's kind of an overview of how everything is connected inside of modern PCs. BIOS. BIOS stands for Basic Input-Output System. The BIOS is a program built into your motherboard. Its purpose is to give the motherboard the initial programming that allows it to function. But it does a number of other things as well. Remember, I was talking about my old computer that I worked with in high school with the switches on the front panel. Originally it didn't have any kind of programming built into it. When you turned it on, it was totally brain dead in effect because it had nothing in its memory. So you had to toggle bytes in manually one at a time. And then later we added a type of read-only memory to it that stored a small program called a bootloader, so that we could turn our computer on and not have to toggle in the initial program. So that bootloader was one of the functions of the BIOS, by the way, is to act as a bootloader. It was the boot up sequence, we call that. Other things that the BIOS does is to do a power on self-test, or post. When you first turn on your computer, the BIOS tests the hardware, the major hardware components. So it'll test memory, video, I/O, input-output devices like the keyboard and mouse. All get checked when you first turn on your computer by the power on self-test. The CMOS setup program refers to the settings for the BIOS. And it's called CMOS because originally the PC had a CMOS memory that stored the BIOS. What's a CMOS memory? Well, CMOS stands for complementary metal oxide semiconductor, and it was a type of memory referred to as static memory. It was a kind of memory that did not need to be refreshed like RAM does in our PCs. Our main memory on our computer uses a kind of memory called RAM that is dynamic RAM, and that means that it has to be refreshed periodically. The contents of the memory has to be written back every once in a while and recharged, or it will be lost, because what it's really stored in is little tiny capacitors. But the static memory, or CMOS type memory, did not have to be refreshed. As long as there was power applied, or even just a voltage applied by a little battery, this kind of memory would not forget. So the BIOS had that type of memory associated with it, and the purpose of that memory was to store data and settings for the BIOS. And so originally the motherboards had a battery on them, and that battery would maintain the settings of the CMOS static memory chip. And the static memory chips didn't really use any power as long as they weren't changing states. In other words, there wasn't anything being written into them or read from them. They really didn't use any electric power at all. All they needed was a battery there to maintain a voltage of 5 volts on them or whatever, or 3 volts. And they would just they would store all their memory settings as long as that battery was there. And that could be for years. So the original IBM PC and compatible computers had that kind of a battery arrangement there. Later models don't even use the CMOS memory anymore. They use flash memory, which doesn't need a battery to maintain the memory contents. Another major purpose of the BIOS is to act as a communication between I/O devices. In fact, that's its primary purpose. BIOS stands for Basic Input Output System, and that's its job, is to communicate between the operating system that runs on the computer and the various input and output devices connected to the computer. So it acts as a go-between. So the operating system, for example, when it wants to communicate with a hard drive, it communicates to the BIOS. The BIOS then would talk to the hard drive. Or if the operating system wants to get something from the keyboard, it would talk to the BIOS, and the BIOS would get that information. Or the mouse. Or basic video input and output would be through the BIOS. So the BIOS was a go-between, if you will, between the operating system and the hardware. And we talked a little bit about that in our last chapter on the operating system as well. Now the CMOS setup on the PC was a way of setting some of the settings for the BIOS. For example, if you added new hardware, you would have to go into the CMOS setup program to tell it what kind of hardware you had. If you had a new disk drive, hard drive particularly, you'd go into the setup and you'd tell it what kind of hard drive you attached to the computer. You could also set up settings for management of the power. If you had a computer, you wanted to have it turn off if nobody was using it for a while, or to save electricity, you could do that in the BIOS. And it had settings for all the input-output devices and ports that you could change if you wanted to or needed to. And today's CMOS data, so-called CMOS data, is no longer needs a battery. We could just as well call it BIOS settings, and that would be another good name for this. But we don't need batteries anymore for that. So because they use flash memory. And by the way, this is actually a BIOS chip here. It was a read-only memory that would contain the BIOS. But in later versions, this became a flash memory, which you could alter. So you could change the BIOS. This is what the CMOS setup program looks like on a typical PC, and it's just a program that is built into the BIOS that would run, and you'd have to access it. And you do that when you first power up your computer. And you can set things, well, like the date and time are built into this, because that's one of the functions of BIOS, is to keep track of the date and time, along with a special clock chip, which, by the way, still uses the battery. So there still is a battery on your motherboard, but its purpose isn't anymore to maintain the settings for the BIOS, but rather to keep the clock and the date and time running. This would have information about the disk drives, such as hard drives and CD drives and DVD drives. Video, it would have information about the memory, how the computer would boot up, and other variety of settings. This is something that's built into the motherboard, something you can access on any motherboard, although the way you access it is different from one motherboard to another. It depends on the particular BIOS that's installed on there. Some BIOSes you might press the delete key while you're turning on a computer, or the escape key, or maybe another key that you'd have to press, like one of the F keys, function keys. So it really depends heavily on what kind of motherboard you happen to have or what model computer. Usually the computer will tell you very briefly when it's starting up what button you have to press on the keyboard to get the setup, to get into the setup program. Let me ask you a few questions. What is a couple things on the motherboard here? What kind of expansion slot is this different oddball looking one here that's different than the others? It's darker colored and longer. What kind of expansion slot would that be? That's called AGP. And then next to it is another expansion slot, different type, called PCI. And those were two examples of expansion slots that were common on the original IBM PC. What kind of form factor is this particular motherboard here? Well, that's the ATX form factor, and you can tell it's an ATX form factor because of the clustering of the I/O input-output connectors. What kind of motherboard form factor is this? Well, this is one of those low-profile ones. This is called the NLX, and it was a low-profile design. So the expansion slots are on a riser card. Which of the following bus types is used to provide communication between high-speed devices mounted closely to the CPU? Would that be considered to be the data bus, the internal bus, the local bus, or the I/O bus? Yes, that would be the local bus because that is the high-speed communication between the CPU and the Northbridge chip. Which of the following bus types is used to connect the CPU to the expansion slots? Would it be the data bus, the internal bus, the local bus, or the I/O bus? Well, the expansion slot contain I/O devices, right? Input-output connections to the outside, and that would be things like video and sound, and other devices would connect there. So that would be part of the I/O bus. The chipset is divided into the blank bridge and the blank bridge. What are those two chips called? They're called the North and the South bridge. North bridge and South bridge. The North bridge is the faster one, and the South bridge is for the slower devices. But they work together as a chipset. The blank bridge of the chipset is used to control the high-speed data systems. Which one is the high-speed one? Yeah, it's the North bridge. And the blank bridge of the chipset is used to control slower devices associated with the PCI and ISA bus. Which one is that? That's considered to be the South bridge. Now, why are they called North and South? Well, if you turn the motherboard so that the CPU is on the top of the board, the top being north of a map, that's why they call it the North, and then the other one is usually down on the other side of them, or the lower part of the motherboard, if that would be considered the bottom or the south part of the board. Alright, let's take a break and I'll come back and talk about expansion slots a little more in detail.